Cinema has the power to entertain, to move, and sometimes to leave deep marks on those who watch. There are films that go beyond the simple concept of liking or disliking, works that, even though technically flawless, are not necessarily made to be enjoyed, but rather to be endured. They are intense experiences, with themes that directly confront the darkest corners of human reality. Watching these productions requires emotional preparation, and even then they continue to echo in the mind long after the credits roll. But what makes a film visually beautiful, narratively engaging, and at the same time emotionally devastating? The answer may lie in the union between form and content, when direction, script, and acting work together to transport the viewer to real or symbolic settings of suffering and brutality without offering relief. And in the face of that, the big question arises: how can these works be considered masterpieces, even when they are nearly impossible to watch more than once? Hello, restless minds. I'm Code, and this is Discover It, where curiosity has no limits. Subscribe and help the channel grow, because every time you like, comment, or share, you're helping us bring these discoveries to more people. Together, we can create a community where curiosity can change the world. And now, without further ado, let's get to the video. All Quiet on the Western Front began as a powerful novel, but its most recent adaptation, released in 2022, brought back the brutality of World War I with a visual and emotional force that's nearly unbearable. Although there's a classic 1930 version, it's the contemporary German version where the nightmare of the trenches gains new life, or rather, reveals the absolute emptiness of it. It's not just a war film, but a raw dive into a system of destruction that crushes human beings without mercy or meaning. Everything is built to show that in war there are no heroes, only temporary survivors. From the very first sequence, the viewer is thrown into the center of the horror. The uniform passed from a dead soldier to a newly enlisted one already reveals that, to the state, bodies are recyclable resources. The muddy land, the deafening explosions, and the muffled screams compose a symphony of terror where every detail is too real to allow any emotional detachment. Each scene is like a blunt punch that doesn't ask permission and offers no space to breathe. Is there anything more terrifying than the mechanical repetition of death as routine? Unlike many films of the genre that romanticize camaraderie or glorify sacrifice, this one makes it clear that the only guaranteed outcome for soldiers is oblivion. The direction opts for long, suffocating shots, while the ambient sound transforms the battlefield into a living organism that devours everything around it. There is no heroic soundtrack to lull the deaths, only noise, mud, and the psychological collapse of young men who dreamed of glory but found madness. And when the war finally seems close to ending, the final blow of irony comes. A German general, driven by empty pride, orders a final attack minutes before the ceasefire. The sequence, desperate in its insane logic, ends with the protagonist's death just seconds before peace is declared. How can one ignore the cruel absurdity of dying for nothing when the war was already won, or perhaps had been lost from the start? Despite being set over a century ago, the film resonates with unsettling relevance. In times of still active conflicts around the world, the question remains: have we learned anything from all this, or are we still trapped in the same cycle of blood and silence? Released in 1988, Grave of the Fireflies is a rare example of animation that breaks all genre barriers to dive into the territory of historical tragedy. Directed by Isao Takahata and produced by Studio Ghibli, the film is set in the final moments of World War II in Japan, but unlike grand military or political narratives, the focus here is on two ordinary siblings trying to survive amidst the total collapse of their society. And it's precisely in the simplicity of this premise that its devastating power lies. The story follows Seita, a teenager, and his younger sister Setsuko after the bombing of Kobe. Without parents, without a home, and without food, the two must find shelter and sustenance in a land marked by destruction and indifference. War in the film is not portrayed by armies or epic battles, but by emptiness, the absence of care, the ruin of institutions, the erosion of empathy. Can a collapsing society preserve any trace of humanity? The choice to begin the film with Seta's death is no accident. From the start, the viewer is told they're about to witness a path with no return, where hope is a distant shadow. The contrast between the delicacy of the animation and the weight of the content creates a disconcerting experience. There is beauty in the drawings and in the quiet moments between the siblings, but there is also a constant sense of urgency and decay, as if every scene were a prelude to a greater tragedy. The breaking point comes gradually, but inevitably. As Setsuko weakens little by little, Seta tries to support them both with increasingly scarce resources. The society around them seems to have given up on caring for its children, and for itself. When Setsuko's death finally arrives, what could be an emotional climax becomes just another inevitable step in a line of continuous losses. The image of her body being cremated while fireflies dance in the sky carries a silent, yet devastating symbolism. Grave of the Fireflies is often cited as the saddest animated film of all time, and not without reason. Its intimate, sensitive, and direct approach turns a historical tragedy into a deeply human experience. By telling the story of just two children, does the film say more about the nature of war than any grand war epic ever could? First aired by the BBC in 1984, Threads is considered by many to be the most disturbing audiovisual work ever made about the impact of nuclear war. Unlike many films in the genre that rely on suspense or action aesthetics, this British project opts for stark, almost documentary realism. It simulates what would happen to British society, especially in the city of Sheffield, if a large-scale nuclear conflict were to occur. And what is seen on screen is so raw, so plausible, and so desolate that many viewers report never being able to watch it again. The narrative follows two main characters, Ruth, a young pregnant woman, and Jimmy, her boyfriend, trying to deal with the beginning of social collapse. However, rather than focusing on personal journeys, the film soon expands its vision to portray the complete breakdown of civil, political, and economic structures. Streets turn into war zones, hospitals collapse, and the few survivors lose all access to basic resources. How can any trace of civilization be maintained when everything around turns to ash? What sets Threads apart is the absolutely clinical tone with which it handles events. There is no dramatic soundtrack, no heroism, and no emotional relief. It's like watching a government report that has taken visual form. The almost impersonal narration, combined with increasingly shocking images of human and environmental degradation, creates a sense of total helplessness. There is no room for hope. Could this be the most realistic portrayal of what it truly means to live in a post-nuclear world? As time advances, after the attack, the film shows the long-term effects of radiation, hunger, and the absence of a functional social network. Decades pass, and the new generation, children born after the attack, grow up in an environment of brutality, ignorance, and genetic deterioration. Civilization, as it was known, simply disappears. What remains is a humanity reduced to instinct, plunged into cultural and physical darkness. The inevitable question arises: how far can we fall when the structure that supports our lives disappears overnight? Even with all the technological advances since 1984, Threads remains an unsurpassed reference on nuclear fear. Based on real studies from the time, its impact lies not in the explosions themselves, but in what comes after. Life without a future. And in the face of so many modern conflicts and rising geopolitical tensions, how can we ignore the terrifying relevance of this work even today? Released in 1971 and directed by Stanley Kubrick, A Clockwork Orange remains one of the most controversial and studied cinematic works in film history. Based on the novel of the same name by Anthony Burgess, the film is set in a distorted and chaotic future where youth violence and moral collapse go hand in hand. Following the trajectory of Alex DeLarge, the leader of a gang that commits brutal crimes, the film exposes a society in ruins, where concepts of ethics, punishment, and control are stretched to the limit. From the very first minutes, the film's atmosphere carries an unsettling strangeness. The minimalist sets and eccentric costumes reinforce the idea of a world that has lost its sense of order. Alex and his droogs roam the night committing assaults and invasions, while the viewer is forced to face this violence with an almost clinical coldness. There is no glamour, nor any intent to justify behavior. Everything is shown as it is, with disturbing objectivity. Is this a portrait of a youth without restraint or a dark mirror of where modern society can go? The turning point comes when Alex is arrested and subjected to a government experiment known as the Ludovico treatment, a psychological conditioning technique aimed at eliminating his ability to commit violent acts. At first glance, the proposal seems like a radical but effective solution. But the way the film portrays this process raises profound questions about free will, punishment, and state coercion. The violence is removed, but with it, the capacity for choice. Alex's transformation, from aggressor to prisoner of his own body, creates an unease that is not easily resolved. Kubrick conducts this journey with a calculated and impactful aesthetic. The soundtrack, full of classical music, especially Beethoven, is used subversively, turning scenes of horror into almost operatic experiences. The symmetrical shots, cold cinematography, and carefully controlled pacing intensify the feeling that everything is off-kilter. But nothing is accidental. Every detail carries meaning, and every silence weighs as much as the dialogue filled with slang and linguistic distortions created especially for the film. A Clockwork Orange was banned in the UK for decades, not for its visual excesses, but for the complexity of its message. The discomfort generated by this work does not come only from the brutality displayed, but from the way it questions society's role in creating monsters and in trying to forcibly correct them. What is more disturbing, the violent criminal or the state that turns him into something harmless at the cost of his autonomy? Based on the memoirs of Polish musician Władysław Szpilman, the pianist, released in 2002 and directed by Roman Polanski, is a meticulous and harrowing portrayal of the destruction caused by the Holocaust. The narrative takes place in Warsaw during the Nazi occupation, following Szpilman, a talented Jewish pianist, as his life gradually falls apart while the regime intensifies. The choice to follow a single individual amidst one of history's greatest horrors offers an intimate viewpoint that highlights not only the barbarity, but also survival in its rawest form. The transformation of the environment is depicted progressively, from social marginalization to forced segregation in the ghetto, from loss of possessions to family separation, and finally, complete disconnection from any social structure. Each of these stages is shown with attention to detail, almost as if the film is recording a visual diary of dehumanization. The soundtrack, composed of pieces by Chopin, is not merely part of the setting, but a constant reminder of the protagonist's identity and talent, elements the world around him tries to erase. While most war films focus on direct conflict, The Pianist chooses to explore the effects of societal collapse through silence, isolation, and waiting. Szpilman does not take part in armed rebellions, nor does he get involved in major political events. He survives, and it is in that process that the film finds its greatest strength, in the effort to stay alive even when everything else has already been lost. The ruins of Warsaw, the cracked walls of buildings, and the empty rooms where he hides become protagonists just as much as he does. Adrien Brody's performance, which earned him an Oscar for the role, is restrained and observant. He moves through the story without grand speeches or heroic gestures. Most of his acting is in his eyes, his thin and hunched body, his hands that keep playing the piano even when there's no sound anymore. The suffering is never romanticized. Every scene, every gesture, every moment of escape or frustrated hope is filled with the weight of someone witnessing the end of a civilization through the eyes of someone simply trying to keep existing. In the end, Szpilman survives, but the world he once knew no longer exists. The physical and emotional scars are everywhere in the buildings, on the sidewalks, and in the faces of those who remain. The lingering question is direct and unsettling. What does it mean to survive when everything around you has been erased? Directed by Darren Aronofsky, Requiem for a Dream was released in 2000 and quickly established itself as one of the most visceral and dark representations of the degradation caused by addiction. Instead of focusing on a single character, the film follows four individuals whose lives intertwine in a spiral of self-destruction. Harry, his girlfriend Marion, his best friend Tyrone, and his mother Sarah. Each deals with a different kind of dependency, but all end up following the same path, a one-way journey toward physical and psychological collapse. The film's narrative structure is divided by the seasons, a clear metaphor for the transformation and progressive decline of the characters. At first, there's an illusion of control, of achievable dreams, of plans being made. But as time passes, goals become distorted and the obsession with immediate satisfaction takes over. Is it possible to maintain any sense of humanity when everything revolves around the next fix, the next escape from reality? The answer is not given through words, but through increasingly chaotic imagery. Visual aesthetics are a fundamental element in Requiem for a Dream. Aronofsky uses rapid cuts, repetitive montages, and a restless camera to simulate the characters' mental states. Each time a substance is consumed, the sequence repeats. Dilated pupils, racing heartbeat, heavy breathing. These visual patterns reinforce the cyclical nature of addiction and place the viewer inside the character's sensory experience in an almost suffocating way. And as the addiction intensifies, the cuts quicken, the images distort, and the world begins to fragment. Unlike other narratives about drug dependency, this film offers no room for redemption. As the story progresses toward its final act, each character reaches their own personal hell. Sarah, alone in her apartment, spirals into psychotic delusions induced by prescribed amphetamines. Harry, hospitalized, has his arm amputated after an infection from continued heroin use. Marion submits to humiliating situations to get drugs, and Tyrone, imprisoned, faces racism and misery behind bars. None of these situations are softened. All are shown with brutal coldness. The film's climax, a frenetic montage intercutting the characters' final fates, is perhaps one of the most harrowing moments in modern cinema. There is no hope, no cut to a better future, no moral lesson. Only bodies and minds torn apart by choices that began as attempts to cope with pain, but ended up becoming the very source of it. How does one go on after touching the darkest depths of existence? United 93, directed by Paul Greengrass and released in 2006, is an immersive portrayal of the events aboard United Airlines Flight 93, one of the four planes hijacked during the September 11, 2001 attacks. Unlike other productions on the same topic, this film adopts an almost documentary-style approach, avoiding sensationalism and focusing on a restrained and detailed reconstruction of the flight's final moments. The choice to use mostly unknown actors and a jittery handheld camera reinforces its commitment to authenticity and proximity. The narrative unfolds almost in real time, covering the final hours of the flight, from boarding to the tragic conclusion. The script alternates between the cockpit, the aviation and military command centers, and the interior of the plane. This structure allows the viewer to witness not only the passengers' reactions, but also the chaos within the response coordination during an unprecedented attack. How do you react when there are no precedents? How do you make decisions when time is scarce and the impact is immeasurable? By avoiding dramatic soundtracks or expository dialogue, the film creates a raw and realistic atmosphere. Conversations among passengers and crew are fragmented, often overlapping, as would be natural in a panic situation. Tension builds organically, driven by silence, glances, and subtle gestures. There's no construction of individual heroes, only ordinary people trying to understand what's happening and, later, deciding to act. That collective decision is what transforms the tragedy into a narrative of resistance. The film's focus is not on violence, but on humanity in the face of catastrophe. As passengers realize their plane is being used as a weapon, they organize an improvised counterattack that, while not saving their lives, prevented an even greater tragedy on the ground. The crash of the flight in an empty field in Pennsylvania was not a matter of chance, but the result of direct action in impossible circumstances. There is a quiet dignity in every gesture shown, a kind of courage that requires no speeches. United 93 offers no catharsis. In the end, the silence that takes over the screen is more eloquent than any explosion. The tragedy remains intact, unadorned, without comforting endings. All that remains is the lasting impact of a choice made in desperation. When all seemed lost, the reaction of those passengers still echoes as a silent question. What would you do if you had only minutes to choose between fear and action? Released in 2013 and directed by Steve McQueen, 12 Years a Slave is an adaptation of the autobiography of Solomon Northup, a free black man who was kidnapped in 1841 and sold into slavery in the southern United States. The film doesn't soften its subject matter or offer emotional shortcuts. On the contrary, it presents a direct chronology of humiliation, brutality, and silent resistance. There is no romance, no heroic distortion, only the harsh reality of one of the cruelest institutions in American history. Solomon's journey begins in New York, where he lives with his family and works as a musician. After being deceived by two men who promise an artistic tour, he is drugged and wakes up chained in a basement. From there, the story takes him through different plantations under the control of masters with varying degrees of cruelty. With each change, a new layer of dehumanization is imposed. How can one maintain sanity when their very identity is forcibly erased? The direction opts for long and silent shots, forcing the viewer to keep their eyes fixed on uncomfortable scenes. In one of them, Solomon is hanged from a tree and remains dangling, barely keeping himself alive by standing on tiptoe, while life on the plantation continues in background. This aesthetic choice reveals institutionalized absurdity. Violence becomes background noise, a natural part of daily life. What does this say about the society that allowed and sustained such a structure? The performances are of rare intensity. Chiwetel Ejiofor, in the lead role, carries the narrative's weight through restrained gestures and the silent gaze of someone who sees everything but cannot react without risking his life. Lupita Nyong'o, in her role as Patsy, conveys with precision the pain and submission imposed on a woman marked by physical and psychological abuse. The suffering portrayed is continuous, without breaks, without promises of imminent liberation. And even when it comes after 12 years, there is no celebration, only a subdued reunion and the lingering doubt of what was truly recovered. 12 Years a Slave does not seek to provoke empathy in a comfortable way. It forces the viewer to confront a past that, while distant in time, remains present in its social consequences. At the end of a narrative, a question lingers like a shadow. How is it possible that something so monstrous was legitimized by laws, religions, and governments for so long? Come and See, released in 1985 and directed by Elim Klimov, is considered by many critics and historians to be the most relentless cinematic portrayal of World War II. The Soviet production is set in Nazi-occupied Belarus and follows the journey of Floria, a teenage boy who joins the local resistance. The narrative, however, does not celebrate acts of bravery or military victories. Instead, it dives into the collapse of innocence and the experience of absolute horror through the eyes of someone swallowed by it far too young to understand. The film begins with Floria excitedly digging through the sand in search of a buried weapon. On his face is the naivety of someone who sees war as a rite of passage, a grand adventure. But that vision soon crumbles. As he moves farther from home, the world around him disintegrates into violence, desolation, and noise. The colors, the sounds, and even the camera itself begin to change. What at first seems like just another war narrative transforms into a nightmare lived in real time. What happens when a child's eyes are forced to absorb the unthinkable? Klimov's direction opts for a deeply immersive approach. The camera, often in close-up, follows Floria's face as he witnesses massacres, rapes, and the complete destruction of villages. One of the most disturbing moments in cinema happens here, an almost interminable scene in which dozens of civilians are locked inside a barn and burned alive. There is no soundtrack to soften the impact, no cuts to provide relief, only the slow and inevitable march of barbarity. In this context, violence is not choreographed. It is documented, raw, and offers no refuge for the viewer. As the film progresses, Floria changes before the camera. His once expressive face becomes rigid, almost aged. Makeup highlights his exhaustion, but it's Alexei Kravchenko's performance that carries the weight of the transformation. The boy's eyes, once full of life, now hold an irreversible emptiness. By the end, when he fires his rifle at a portrait of Hitler, as archival footage rewinds through time, there is no feeling of triumph, only the awareness of the irreparable damage caused by every second of war. Come and See is not a film to be watched, it is a film to be confronted. Each scene seems to demand a choice, look away or endure. And in the end, the question is no longer how war affects its participants, but rather, how is it possible for anyone to remain human after witnessing such brutality? Released in 2023 and directed by Sean Durkin, The Iron Claw tells the tragic, true story of the Von Erich family, icons of American professional wrestling. Unlike what is typically expected from sports films, there is no glorious triumph or happy ending here. The film instead exposes the weight of a family legacy and the consequences of toxic masculinity passed down through generations. Based on real events, the plot follows a sequence of losses so relentless that at times it seems almost unbelievable, but everything truly happened. The story centers around Kevin Von Erich and his brothers, all trained by their father, Fritz, a former wrestler determined to turn his sons into champions. The extreme discipline and pressure for success imposed by the patriarch shaped the boys' behavior both inside and outside the ring. Success comes, but at what cost? Physical injuries, emotional instability, and personal tragedies begin to accumulate as invisible scars, more painful than any blow in combat. How can the body remain strong when the mind begins to fall apart? The screenplay presents events in chronological order, but without haste. Each moment of celebration is followed by an abrupt fall. The death of one brother follows another's success, creating an atmosphere where hope becomes fragile. The cinematography adds to this, with cold tones contrasting with the vibrant lights of the wrestling ring. The wrestling spectacle is shown as a stage for a family drama where real pain hides behind masks and performances. Could these fights be mere reflections of unresolved inner battles? The performances carry a deep emotional weight, with standout work from Zac Efron as Kevin. His physical transformation is impressive, but it's in the silent glances, the pauses, and the intimate moments with his brothers that the narrative truly breathes. The connection between the Von Erich family members is palpable, making each loss all the more painful. The absence of overt melodrama reinforces the authenticity of the story. The suffering is there, but it is never dramatized. It is restrained, real, almost suffocating. In the end, only Kevin remains, the survivor of a lineage marked by glory and grief. In a breathtaking final scene, he kneels before his small children who hug him silently. There is no dialogue, only the presence of continuity. The Iron Claw is not just a portrait of family tragedy, but a reflection on how far a parent's dreams can crush their children. When victory is imposed as obligation, what happens to those who lose everything in the process? Throughout this journey, what has been revealed are not just sad or heavy films, but works that challenge the very definition of entertainment. Each one carries the responsibility of exposing uncomfortable truths, portraying collective or individual traumas, and provoking reflections that endure over time. What these titles have in common is the courage not to soften reality. They are experiences that don't ease, don't comfort. And for that very reason, they remain. They are not made to be watched again, but to never be forgotten. These are films that demand something from the viewer: attention, courage, empathy. Because in the face of so much horror, pain, and desolation, art refuses to be just a mirror. It is also a denunciation, a memory, a warning. And if there's one legacy that each of these narratives leaves behind, it's the reminder that some stories need to be told, even if it hurts to hear them. If you enjoyed this journey of discovery, don't forget to leave a like, share it with your friends, and comment down below what caught your attention the most. Maybe others will relate, and we can start a great conversation. And of course, subscribe to the channel for more content where curiosity has no limits.